August 23rd, 1944. Morning light. The balcony of the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli. General d'Infanterie. Dietrich von Koltitz stood with his hands behind his back, looking out across the Tuileries gardens toward the Place de la Concorde. The Louvre stretched away to his right. Notre Dame's towers rose in the distance beyond the Seine. 3 tons of dynamite sat beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceilings at that very moment. 2 more tons packed the golden dome of Les Invalides. 1 ton in the Chamber of Deputies. Every bridge across the Seine wired to blow. Colonel Hans J., his second in command, stood beside him. Neither man spoke. The telephone on von Koltitz's desk had rung an hour earlier. The message from Field Marshal Model's headquarters was brief. Hitler's order, transmitted through proper channels, typed on official paper with all the correct stamps and signatures. The Führer's words were unambiguous. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Sevenu. Koltitz was 50 years old. He had spent the better part of 3 decades in uniform. He had fought in the trenches of the Great War as a young lieutenant. He had survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the expansion of the new Wehrmacht. He had commanded troops in Poland, in Holland, across the steppes of Russia. He had taken Sevastopol after months of brutal siege warfare. He had earned his reputation the hard way, one destroyed city at a time. They called him the Smasher of Cities, not without reason. Rotterdam had burned on his watch in May 1940. Sevastopol had been reduced to rubble in 1942. When the Wehrmacht needed someone to level a city, when demolition and destruction were required, von Koltitz received the assignment. He understood the work. He had never flinched from it before. But Paris was different. Von Koltitz turned from the window. The order sat on his desk, waiting for his compliance. 20,000 troops under his command, most of them administrative. Personnel, clerks and supply officers, and rear echelon soldiers who had never fired a rifle in anger. No heavy armor, no air support, fuel supplies dwindling by the hour, ammunition stocks already critically low, and the enemy was coming. The French resistance had risen 4 days earlier on August 19th. Street fighting had broken out across the city. Barricades appeared overnight. His men reported gunfire from rooftops, from windows, from alleys. The French 2nd Armored Division was approaching from the north, American forces from the south. The bridge at Meilen had already fallen to Allied troops. Hitler wanted him to fight, to defend Paris to the last man and the last bullet, to turn the City of Light into a smoldering ruin. Von Koltitz had met Adolf Hitler just 15 days earlier, on August 8th, at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. The Führer had been different then, diminished. The July 20th assassination attempt had left Hitler shaken and paranoid. He raged about traitors and cowards. His hands trembled. His eyes held a quality von Koltitz had not seen before, something manic and disconnected from the reality of Germany's military situation. Hitler had told him then what he expected. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Standing on the balcony overlooking the most beautiful city in Europe, von Koltitz understood what that order meant. Not just the bridges, the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, the opera, the museums and churches and monuments that had stood for centuries, all of it reduced to rubble and ash. The medieval command, he would later call it, an order from another age, from a mind that had lost touch with reality and military necessity both. But he was a German officer. He had sworn an oath. He had followed orders his entire life, even when those orders demanded things that turned his stomach. Discipline had been the foundation of his career, the bedrock principle that had carried him from lieutenant to general. Now that foundation was cracking beneath his feet. Von Koltitz returned to his desk. The explosives were in place. His engineers had spent weeks preparing the demolitions. 3 tons in Notre Dame, 2 in Les Invalides, 1 in the Chamber of Deputies, the bridges wired and ready. All he needed to do was give the word, and Paris would burn. But the question remained, hanging in the air of that sunlit room overlooking the Tuileries. Would he give that word? Dietrich von Koltitz was born on November 9th, 1894, in Grefflich-Wiese, a small town in Silesia near the Polish border. His family was minor nobility, Prussian to the core, with a military tradition stretching back generations. His grandfather had served in the wars of German unification. His father had been an officer in the Kaiser's army. Service to the state was not optional in families like his. It was expected, bred into the bone, part of the family identity as fundamental as their name. The von Choltitz family was not wealthy by the standards of German aristocracy. They did not own vast estates or maintain houses in Berlin. They were provincial nobility. Their status derived more from service than from land or money. For sons in such families, the military offered the clearest path to advancement and honor. Dietrich's future was decided before he could walk. He entered military service as the 20th century began its second decade. By 1913, young von Koltitz was a cadet in the Saxon Infantry Regiment, learning the basics of military science as Prussia had perfected them: drill, discipline, obedience, hierarchy. The German military system of the early 20th century was the most professional in Europe, perhaps in the world. It valued precision, training, and absolute adherence to orders. Von Koltitz absorbed these lessons thoroughly. He was not brilliant, not the kind of tactical genius who rewrote doctrine or invented new strategies, but he was competent, thorough, reliable. These qualities would serve him well. By the time the Great War erupted in August 1914, von Choltitz was a young officer in the Reichsheer, eager for glory and advancement. He was 19 years old. He believed, as most young men of his generation believed, that the war would be short and glorious. German armies would sweep through Belgium and France, capture Paris, and be home by Christmas. It was what everyone said. It was what everyone believed. He got something else instead. 4 years in the trenches, watching men die in mud and wire, learning that modern war had nothing to do with glory and everything to do with industrial slaughter. Von Koltitz served on the Western Front for most of the war. He was there for Verdun, though not in the worst sectors. He was there for the Somme, though again his regiment was not in the heaviest fighting. He was fortunate in that way. He saw enough combat to earn his credentials as a fighting officer, but not so much that he was killed or crippled like so many of his peers. The trenches taught lessons that no military academy could provide. Von Koltitz learned that modern warfare was not about brave charges and heroic stands. It was about logistics, getting ammunition forward, getting wounded men back, maintaining supply lines, keeping troops fed and equipped. It was about endurance, surviving the artillery barrages, the gas attacks, the constant grinding attrition that wore down units and men alike. He learned that officers who led from the front died quickly. Officers who managed resources and planned carefully survived. Von Koltitz became a survivor. He was wounded once, not seriously. A shell fragment caught him in the leg during a bombardment in 1916. He spent 2 months recovering in a hospital in Germany, then returned to the front. The wound earned him a decoration. More importantly, it established his credentials as a combat veteran. He had bled for the fatherland. Von Koltitz survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. Regiment he had joined in 1913 was a ghost of itself by 1918. Most of the officers he had trained with were dead. The enlisted men were exhausted, underfed, demoralized. When the armistice came in November 1918, it was less a defeat than a collapse. The army simply stopped fighting because there was no point in continuing. He emerged from the war with his body intact, his illusions shattered, and a deep understanding of how fragile human life became when subjected to artillery and machine guns. The experience marked him, as it marked all who endured those years, but it did not break him. Von Koltitz was a survivor. That was perhaps his defining characteristic. He survived. The Weimar Republic that followed Germany's defeat was chaos. The Kaiser had abdicated. The monarchy was gone. Communist uprisings erupted in Berlin and Munich. Right-wing paramilitaries fought in the streets. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory, imposed crippling reparations, and reduced the once proud German military to a fraction of its former size. The army that von Koltitz had known was reduced to a shadow of itself by the Treaty of Versailles. The Reichswehr, limited by treaty to 100,000 men, became a refuge for professional soldiers who had nowhere else to go. Millions of men who had served in the Great War found themselves unemployed, cast aside by a republic that neither wanted nor knew what to do with them. Von Koltitz was one of the few who remained in uniform. His officer status, his combat record, and his professional competence made him valuable to the Reichswehr leadership. The new German military was small, but it intended to be professional. Officers like von Koltitz, survivors who understood modern warfare, who could train troops and manage logistics, were essential to maintaining even a skeleton force. Through the 1920s, von Koltitz served in various positions within the Reichswehr. He was not a political officer. He did not involve himself in the chaos of Weimar politics, the endless cycle of elections and coalitions and crises that characterized the Republic. He was a military professional, focused on his career, on mastering his craft, on preparing for a future that might someday see Germany strong again. The Reichswehr of the 1920s was a strange institution. Limited by treaty, forbidden from having tanks or aircraft or submarines, it nonetheless maintained the traditions and professionalism of the old imperial army. Officers studied tactics and strategy. They read foreign military journals. They traveled abroad to observe other armies. They prepared quietly and carefully for the day when Germany might rebuild its military power. Von Koltitz absorbed this culture. He attended staff courses. He studied logistics and supply management. He learned languages, French and some English, useful for reading foreign military literature. He was competent without being exceptional, professional without being brilliant. These qualities were enough. In 1923, he married. His wife was from a similar background, minor nobility, provincial family, proper Prussian upbringing. They had children. Von Koltitz's personal life was conventional, unremarkable. He was a professional officer with a family, serving in a diminished army, waiting for something to change. That change came in 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Von Koltitz was not a Nazi in the ideological sense. He did not join the party early. He did not attend the rallies or mouth the slogans with any particular enthusiasm. Politics did not interest him. He was a soldier, not a politician. The Nazis were civilians who happened to control the government. Von Koltitz's loyalty was to the German state and the German military, not to any political party. But Hitler was rebuilding the German military. That interested von Koltitz very much. In 1934, von Koltitz received promotion to major. In 1938, he became a lieutenant colonel. The Wehrmacht, Hitler's new name for the German military, was expanding rapidly. The treaty limitations were being ignored. Germany was rearming. Millions of marks poured into military production. New tanks, new aircraft, new ships. The army grew from 100,000 men to hundreds of thousands. For a career officer like von Koltitz, this expansion was opportunity. Skilled officers were in demand. Someone who understood logistics, who could train troops, who had combat experience from the Great War. Such men were valuable to a regime preparing for war. Von Koltitz had skills. He understood logistics and administration. He could read maps and coordinate troop movements. He was competent, reliable, and willing to follow orders without asking uncomfortable questions. These qualities made him valuable to a regime preparing for war. He knew about the Nazis' activities. Everyone in Germany knew, to some degree. The concentration camps were no secret, at least not in their existence, if not their full extent. The persecution of Jews was public policy. The suppression of political opposition was obvious. The militarization of German society was impossible to miss. Von Koltitz was not horrified by any of this. He was not enthusiastic either. He was indifferent. Politics was for politicians. His job was to be a soldier. If the government wanted to do certain things, that was the government's business. His business was military readiness. This moral compartmentalization was common among German officers of his generation. They saw themselves as professionals, above politics, servants of the state rather than of any particular regime. They could serve the Kaiser or the Weimar Republic or the Nazi government, because their loyalty was to Germany itself, not to whoever happened to be in power. This reasoning allowed them to serve Hitler without considering themselves Nazis. It allowed them to participate in a criminal regime while maintaining their self-image as honorable soldiers. It was, in retrospect, a profound moral failure. But at the time, it seemed perfectly reasonable to men like von Koltitz. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, von Koltitz was there, not in a glamorous combat role, but as a staff officer with the 4th Corps, making sure supplies reached the front and wounded soldiers reached hospitals. The Polish campaign lasted 5 weeks. The Wehrmacht crushed Polish resistance with a combination of speed and firepower that stunned international observers. Von Koltitz learned how modern mechanized warfare functioned when properly executed. Fast, brutal, overwhelming. The coordination of tanks, aircraft, and infantry. The importance of logistics in maintaining rapid advances. The techniques of encirclement and annihilation. Poland was a laboratory for the methods that would define German military operations in the years ahead. Then came France. The invasion of Holland and Belgium in May 1940 brought von Koltitz his first real test as a combat commander. He was assigned to lead infantry units in the Dutch campaign, part of the northern thrust that would outflank French fortifications and open the way to Paris. Holland fell in 5 days. The Dutch army was small, poorly equipped, and overwhelmed by German firepower. Von Choltitz distinguished himself during the campaign, demonstrating an ability to push troops forward under fire and achieve objectives on schedule. He was calm under pressure, competent in execution, willing to press attacks even when casualties mounted. Rotterdam fell on May 14, 1940. Parts of the city burned. The Dutch government surrendered. Von Choltitz's name appeared in reports about the destruction. Not as criticism, quite the opposite. His superiors noted his efficiency, his ability to deliver results. He received commendations, not reprimands. The message was clear. The Wehrmacht valued officers who delivered victories and did not flinch from the costs. This pattern would repeat throughout von Choltitz's career. He was effective. He got results. If those results included destroyed buildings and civilian casualties, that was simply the nature of modern war. The Wehrmacht was not fighting a limited civilized conflict. It was waging total war, and total war required officers who could accept the totality of what that meant. Von Choltitz proved he could accept it. In Holland, in France, and later in Russia, he demonstrated that he would not hesitate when destruction was required. This made him valuable. This made him promotable. By the summer of 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, von Choltitz had proven himself repeatedly. He went east as a commander of infantry troops, no longer merely a staff officer managing logistics from behind the lines. He would lead men in combat, direct attacks, make life and death decisions in real time. The Russian campaign would define the rest of his military career, and Sevastopol would make his reputation. The Eastern Front was different from anything von Choltitz had experienced in France or Poland. The distances were incomprehensible. The Soviet armies seemed limitless. For every division the Wehrmacht destroyed, another appeared. The fighting was savage beyond measure. Both sides committed atrocities as routine practice. Prisoners were shot. Villages were burned. Civilians died by the tens of thousands in the wake of advancing armies. Von Choltitz learned to operate in conditions that would have been unthinkable in Western Europe. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Summer heat turned roads to dust and equipment failures to daily crises. The Russian landscape was vast, empty, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But for all its brutality, the Eastern Front offered opportunities for ambitious officers. The scale of operations was enormous. Commanders led divisions, corps, entire armies. Victory brought rapid promotion. Competence was rewarded. Officers who could deliver results, who could take objectives and hold them against Soviet counterattacks, rose quickly through the Wehrmacht hierarchy. Von Choltitz was one of those officers. By the spring of 1942, he had been in Russia for nearly a year. He had led troops through the initial advances of Operation Barbarossa. He had survived the first terrible Russian winter, when German armies froze in place outside Moscow and Leningrad. He had learned how to fight in conditions that broke lesser men. In April 1942, von Choltitz received new orders. He was assigned to the 11th Army under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders. The mission? Capture Sevastopol, the fortress city on the Crimean Peninsula that had defied German assault for months. Sevastopol was unlike any city von Koltitz had encountered. It was built for siege warfare. The Soviets had spent decades fortifying the position, creating one of the strongest defensive complexes in the world. Underground bunkers held ammunition and supplies. Artillery positions were carved into solid rock. Minefields protected every approach. The garrison numbered over 100,000 troops, well supplied and determined to resist. The 11th Army had been trying to take Sevastopol since late 1941. Every assault had failed. Soviet defenders fought with a ferocity that stunned German commanders. They held positions until annihilated. They counterattacked relentlessly. They refused to surrender even when surrounded and outnumbered. Von Manstein decided on a methodical approach. Artillery would pound Soviet positions day and night. Luftwaffe bombers would crater defensive works. Engineers would clear minefields and blast bunkers. Infantry would advance block by block, building by building, room by room if necessary. It would take time. It would cost lives. But it would work. Von Koltitz commanded infantry units in the siege. His troops were responsible for advancing through specific sectors, seizing designated objectives, holding ground against Soviet counterattacks. The work was brutal beyond description. German artillery fired tens of thousands of shells into Sevastopol daily. The heaviest guns in the Wehrmacht arsenal were brought up. 420 mm howitzers that could destroy bunkers with single shells, railway guns that lobbed projectiles the size of small cars. The bombardment was constant, overwhelming, designed to break Soviet morale through sheer weight of explosives. It did not break Soviet morale. The defenders adapted, moving underground, emerging at night to repair defenses and bring up supplies. They fought on. Von Koltitz's infantry advanced through this landscape of destruction. They moved through streets that no longer existed, past buildings reduced to foundations, over rubble fields that had once been neighborhoods. They cleared bunkers with flamethrowers and satchel charges. They fought hand-to-hand in collapsed buildings and shattered fortifications. The casualties were appalling. German infantry units took 30, 40, sometimes 50% losses in single attacks. Battalions that entered battle with 500 men came out with 200. Companies were wiped out. Officers were killed leading assaults. Replacements arrived and died within days. Von Koltitz pushed his troops forward. He did not flinch from the casualties. This was the nature of siege warfare. Men died. More men replaced them. The advance continued. There was no sentiment involved, no dwelling on losses. The mission was to take Sevastopol, and the mission required accepting whatever casualties were necessary to achieve that objective. Soviet defenders fought with equal ruthlessness. They booby-trapped buildings. They sniped from rubble. They launched counterattacks at night. They held positions until physically overrun, then fought to the last man. Surrender was rare. Most Soviet soldiers chose to die fighting rather than be taken prisoner. Civilians were trapped in the city throughout the siege. Tens of thousands of them, unable to evacuate, caught between German assault and Soviet defense. They sheltered in basements and underground chambers. They died in bombardments and street fighting. They starved as food supplies dwindled. The siege spared no one. Von Koltitz directed his troops through this hell for weeks. From late May through June 1942, the 11th Army ground forward. Every block was contested. Every building was fought over. Progress was measured in meters. not kilometers. The map of Sevastopol filled with marks indicating destroyed positions, cleared sectors, seized objectives. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet provided naval gunfire support for the defenders. Warships offshore fired their main batteries into German positions, adding to the artillery duel that consumed tons of ammunition hourly. The Luftwaffe attacked the fleet, sinking some ships, driving others away. But the naval support continued, making every German advance more costly. By late June, Soviet resistance was crumbling. Supply lines across the bay were severed. Ammunition was running low. Food was nearly gone. The garrison was being physically ground down by attrition and exhaustion. German troops controlled most of the city. Soviet forces held only isolated pockets, surrounded and cut off. On July 1st, 1942, after 250 days of siege, organized Soviet resistance collapsed. The remaining defenders retreated to caves and bunkers in the Chersonese Peninsula, where they were systematically destroyed. Some tried to evacuate by sea. Most were killed or captured. By July 4th, the fighting was effectively over. Sevastopol had been taken. The city was a ruin. Not a single building stood intact. Streets were impassable, filled with rubble and unexploded ordnance. Bodies lay everywhere. German soldiers, Soviet troops, civilians. The smell of death hung over everything. Von Koltitz's infantry had been at the center of the final assault. His troops had fought their way through some of the worst sectors, taking casualties that would have broken less disciplined units. He had demonstrated exactly what Wehrmacht leadership valued: the ability to push men forward into impossible situations and achieve objectives regardless of cost. Field Marshal von Manstein submitted commendations. Von Koltitz received promotion to Major General in July 1942, immediately after Sevastopol's fall. He was 47 years old. He had risen from lieutenant colonel to general in less than 4 years of war. His career trajectory was remarkable by any standard. But Sevastopol gave him something else besides promotion: a reputation. Von Koltitz was now known throughout the Wehrmacht as an officer who could reduce fortified positions, someone who did not hesitate, someone who understood that modern siege warfare required accepting destruction as necessary and inevitable. They started calling him the Smasher of Cities. The nickname spread. It was not criticism. In the Wehrmacht of 1942, it was recognition of professional skill. Von Koltitz accepted the reputation. He had destroyed Sevastopol. He had led troops through streets turned to rubble. He had watched thousands die and ordered thousands more to attack despite the casualties. He had done what was necessary to achieve military objectives. This was war. This was what war required. Von Koltitz had no illusions about the nature of his profession. He was a destroyer. When the Wehrmacht needed cities reduced, they sent officers like him. Officers who understood the work and would not flinch from it. Through late 1942 and into 1943, von Koltitz continued his career on the Eastern Front. He held various commands, always competent, always reliable. In 1943, he received promotion to lieutenant general. He was now among the senior commanders of the Wehrmacht, a man whose opinion mattered in operational planning. But by the summer of 1943, the tide of war was turning. The Germans had lost at Stalingrad. Soviet offensives were pushing west. The Eastern Front was no longer a story of German victories. It was becoming a story of German retreats, fighting withdrawals, Desperate attempts to stabilize collapsing positions. Von Koltitz understood what the casualty reports and supply statistics meant. Germany was losing the war. Not losing in the sense of temporary setbacks, but losing in the fundamental sense of running out of men, materials, and time. The Soviet Union was producing tanks and artillery faster than Germany could destroy them. American factories were flooding the world with weapons. The strategic situation was hopeless. But von Koltitz was a soldier. His job was to follow orders and execute missions, not to make strategic policy. If Germany was losing, that was for Hitler and the Nazi leadership to address. Von Koltitz's responsibility was to command his troops, achieve his objectives, and do his duty as a German officer. He continued serving. Through 1943 and into 1944, through retreats and defeats and collapsing fronts, he did his job. He followed his orders. He maintained his reputation as a reliable, competent commander who delivered results even in impossible situations. Then came July 1944 and the assassination attempt against Hitler, and everything changed. Von Koltitz understood military reality better than he understood Nazi ideology. Numbers did not lie. Production statistics told stories that propaganda could not contradict. Germany was running out of men, out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of time. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but when and how badly. The military situation reports told the story. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies were destroying German divisions faster than replacements could be trained. In Italy, Allied forces had captured Rome and were pushing north. In France, the Normandy invasion had established an unbreakable beachhead. American and British forces were breaking out from the landing zones, threatening to overrun all of France. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, was shattered. Allied aircraft flew over Germany with near impunity. Cities burned. Industrial production declined. The vaunted German war economy was being pounded into rubble by 1,000-bomber raids. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, which had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942, was being hunted to extinction. New Allied detection technology made submarine warfare suicidal. German naval losses mounted while Allied shipping continued unmolested. Any competent general staff officer could read these statistics and understand their meaning. Germany had lost the war. The only questions remaining were how long the fighting would continue and how many more people would die before the inevitable end. Then came July 20th, 1944, and the assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler. Von Koltitz was not involved in the plot. He was nowhere near the Wolfschanze in East Prussia when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in Hitler's conference room. Von Koltitz was serving in the West, far from the conspiracy centered among general staff officers in Berlin. But the aftermath of the failed assassination reached everywhere in the German military. Officers were arrested by the hundreds. The Gestapo swept through Wehrmacht headquarters, rounding up anyone suspected of involvement or even knowledge of the plot. Summary courts-martial were held. Executions followed within hours of conviction. Hitler's paranoia, already pronounced, reached new heights. He raged about traitors within the Wehrmacht's ranks. The officer corps, which had always maintained some distance from the Nazi Party, was now suspect. Loyalty to Hitler personally became the only virtue that mattered. Professional competence was secondary to political reliability. The purge was systematic and brutal. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Germany's most famous general, was implicated through tangential connections. He was given the choice between suicide and public trial. He chose suicide on October 14th, 1944. His death was announced as the result of injuries from an air attack months earlier. Generals who had served Germany with distinction for decades were hanged on piano wire, their executions filmed for Hitler's viewing. The July 20th conspirators and their suspected associates died slowly, deliberately. Hitler wanted them to suffer. He wanted the officer corps to understand what defiance would cost. Among the officers implicated was General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of Paris. Von Stülpnagel had been part of the conspiracy. On July 20th, after receiving false reports that Hitler had been killed, he had arrested SS and Gestapo officials in Paris. When news arrived that Hitler had survived, von Stülpnagel realized his role in the plot was exposed. He attempted suicide by shooting himself, but survived with severe injuries and blindness. The Gestapo arrested him. He was brought before the People's Court, convicted of treason, and hanged on August 30th, 1944. But before that execution, von Stülpnagel needed to be replaced as military governor of Paris. The position was critical. Paris was the center of German power in France. The garrison controlled communications, administered occupation policy, and suppressed the French resistance. Whoever commanded in Paris needed to be absolutely reliable. On August 7, 1944, von Choltitz received new orders. He was relieved of his current command and appointed military governor of Paris. He would replace von Stülpnagel immediately. He would take control of the garrison, secure the city against uprising, and ensure Paris remained under German control for as long as possible. The promotion was recognition of von Choltitz's reputation. He was known as reliable, competent, absolutely loyal to his duties as a German officer. He had never been associated with any political faction within the Wehrmacht. He was not an intellectual who questioned orders. He was a professional who executed missions, perfect for a position requiring complete trustworthiness. On August 8, 1944, one day after his appointment, von Choltitz flew to East Prussia for a personal meeting with Adolf Hitler at the Wolfschanze. This meeting was not optional. Hitler wanted to assess his new military governor personally, to look him in the eye and ensure his loyalty. The Führer's headquarters was a bunker complex hidden in forests south of Rastenburg, surrounded by minefields, anti-aircraft batteries, and guard posts. Von Choltitz had been to the Wolfschanze before, but never in circumstances like these. The July 20th bomb had damaged buildings and killed officers. Hitler had survived only by chance. Someone had moved the briefcase containing the bomb to the other side of a heavy table leg, shielding Hitler from the worst of the blast. Security was intense. Every visitor was searched multiple times. Armed SS guards were everywhere. The atmosphere was paranoid, hostile, suspicious. This was Hitler's fortress, and everyone there was potentially a traitor until proven otherwise. Von Choltitz was kept waiting for hours. Finally, he was escorted into Hitler's presence. The Führer sat behind a desk, surrounded by maps and reports. His hands trembled slightly, a symptom of Parkinson's disease that Hitler could no longer completely hide. His face was pale. His eyes held a quality von Choltitz had not seen in previous meetings, something manic and disconnected from reality. Hitler spoke at length about traitors, about the cowards and defeatists who had tried to kill him, about the need for absolute loyalty and iron will. His voice shook with rage when he discussed the July 20th conspirators. He ranted about officers who lacked the courage to see Germany's struggle through to its righteous conclusion. Then Hitler turned his attention to Paris. The city must be held, he insisted. Every street must be defended. The French resistance must be crushed. The Allies must pay for every block in blood. Paris was strategically vital, historically significant, politically essential. Its loss would mean the loss of France. Hitler's voice dropped slightly, taking on a harder edge. If Paris could not be held, it must be destroyed. The bridges must be blown before they fell into enemy hands. The monuments must be reduced to rubble. The Allies must inherit nothing but ruins. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins, Hitler said. He repeated the phrase twice more, as if repetition would make the order more binding. Von Koltitz listened without comment. He was an experienced officer. He knew when to speak and when to simply absorb information and wait for dismissal. Hitler made his expectations clear. Von Koltitz acknowledged those expectations with appropriate formality. The meeting lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Von Koltitz was dismissed. He left the Wolfschanze with Hitler's words ringing in his ears. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. But von Koltitz had also observed something during that meeting. Hitler was not the man he had been even a year earlier. The trembling hands, the unfocused eyes, the rage that seemed disconnected from strategic reality. These were symptoms of something deeper than anger or stress. Hitler was deteriorating, physically, certainly, but also mentally. His grasp of military reality seemed tenuous. He spoke of holding positions that could not be held, of launching offensives with divisions that no longer existed, of achieving victories with resources that Germany did not have. Von Koltitz left the Wolfschanze with a disturbing conclusion forming in his mind. Adolf Hitler had lost touch with reality. The man giving orders about Paris had no comprehension of the actual military situation in France. He was commanding from fantasy, not from strategic analysis. This realization would matter greatly in the days ahead. On August 9th, von Koltitz arrived in Paris to assume command. His car entered the city through streets that seemed almost peaceful compared to the battlefields he had left behind. No artillery fire echoed in the distance. No bombed-out buildings lined the roads. Paris had been occupied for 4 years, but it remained structurally intact. The Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli became his headquarters. The building was grand, elegant, precisely the sort of place that German occupation authorities commandeered for their use. Von Koltitz's office was on an upper floor, with tall windows offering views across the Tuileries gardens toward the Place de la Concorde. From those windows, he could see the heart of the city stretching away in all directions. The Tuileries gardens, green and manicured despite the occupation. The Place de la Concorde, with its Egyptian obelisk, standing unchanged since the 1830s. The Seine with its bridges, connecting the left and right banks. Beyond, barely visible, the Eiffel Tower rising against the sky. This was Paris, the city of light, capital of France, center of Western European culture, repository of centuries of art and architecture. Von Koltitz had read about Paris, seen photographs, heard the stories. But being here, seeing it directly, was different. He had destroyed cities before. Sevastopol had burned on his orders. Rotterdam had fallen under his watch. He had earned his reputation honestly, through years of following orders and delivering results. no matter how grim those results might be. But Paris was not Sevastopol. It was not Rotterdam. It was something else entirely. Von Koltitz pushed these thoughts aside. He had a job to do. He was the military governor of Paris, responsible for maintaining German control of the city and its infrastructure. He had orders from Adolf Hitler himself. His duty was clear. The garrison he inherited numbered approximately 20,000 troops on paper. In reality, that number was misleading. Von Koltitz spent his first days in Paris reviewing unit rosters and assessing actual combat strength. What he found was not encouraging. Most of his soldiers were administrative personnel, clerks who managed paperwork, communication specialists who operated telephone exchanges, transportation officers who coordinated rail movements, supply staff who managed warehouses. No, these were necessary positions in any occupation force, but they were not combat troops. Of the 20,000 men under his command, perhaps 5,000 were actual combat-ready infantry, and even those units were not first-line troops. They were security battalions, garrison forces, rear echelon soldiers who had been assigned to Paris precisely because they were not needed on the fighting fronts. Many were older men, veterans of the Great War or the early campaigns of this war, now serving out their time in relatively safe positions. Others were recovering from wounds, not yet ready to return to frontline service. Von Koltitz had no heavy armor available. The panzer divisions had been pulled back to defend against the Allied breakout from Normandy. A few light tanks remained in Paris, enough for patrols and security work, but nothing capable of serious combat operations. He had no air support. The Luftwaffe was fighting for survival over Germany itself. Every available aircraft was committed to defending the Reich from Allied bombing raids. Paris was on its own. Fuel was critically short. The Wehrmacht supply lines were crumbling across France. Fuel depots were running dry. Vehicles sat idle for lack of gasoline. Generators operated on reduced schedules to conserve diesel. Ammunition supplies were dwindling. The garrison had small arms ammunition and some artillery shells, but stocks were limited and resupply was uncertain. If serious fighting broke out, von Koltitz's troops would run out of bullets within days. This was the force Hitler expected to hold Paris against an Allied army backed by overwhelming material superiority. It was absurd on its face. But von Koltitz was a professional soldier. He would make do with what he had and execute his orders to the best of his ability. His orders included preparing Paris for destruction if it could not be held. Von Koltitz called in his chief engineer, a colonel who had been in Paris for months, managing infrastructure and fortifications. They met in von Koltitz's office, spreading maps of the city across a conference table. "Show me the demolition preparations," von Koltitz said. The engineer began pointing to locations on the maps. "We've identified all critical infrastructure points. The bridges across the Seine are the priority. Each bridge has been surveyed for optimal demolition placement. We can drop every one of them with the explosives we have on hand. How long would it take? To wire them all? 2 weeks minimum. But we've already begun preparations on the most important crossings. Those could be ready to blow in days if necessary. And the monuments? The Führer has ordered the destruction of Paris's landmarks." The engineer hesitated. This was where the orders entered territory that made even hardened Wehrmacht officers uncomfortable. "Technically possible, sir, but the resource requirements are Substantial. Explain. Notre Dame Cathedral, for example. To completely destroy the structure would require hundreds of tons of explosives, carefully placed throughout the foundation and supporting pillars. We don't have that much explosive material, and even if we did, the placement would take weeks. The cathedral was built to last centuries. It won't come down easily. What can we do with the resources we have? The engineer consulted his notes. With available explosives, we can severely damage Notre Dame. 3 tons of dynamite placed in the vaults would collapse portions of the roof and possibly bring down one or both towers. The structure would be wrecked, but not completely obliterated. Von Koltitz nodded. Les Invalides? Similar situation. The dome could be destroyed with approximately 2 tons of explosive. The building itself would remain standing, but heavily damaged. The Arc de Triomphe? That presents special challenges. It's solid masonry, extremely thick. Demolishing it completely would require more explosives than we can spare. We could damage it severely, perhaps bring down portions of it, but total destruction. The engineer shook his head. The Eiffel Tower? Impossible with our resources. The tower is iron lattice work. Cutting enough of the structural members to bring it down would require weeks of work and more cutting charges than we possess. We could damage it, certainly, but destroying it is beyond our capabilities. Von Holtitz absorbed this information. Hitler wanted Paris reduced to ruins. What von Holtitz was hearing was that German forces in Paris could damage the city, possibly severely, but completely destroying it, turning it into the field of ruins Hitler demanded, was beyond their means. Proceed with preparations on what we can do, von Koltitz ordered. Start with the bridges, then the major monuments. Calculate explosives requirements and present me with a complete plan within 3 days. Yes, sir. The engineer departed. Von Koltitz returned to his windows, looking out over the Tuileries. He was thinking about Sevastopol, about the weeks of artillery bombardment and infantry assault, about the resources required to reduce a fortress city. Paris was larger than Sevastopol. It was not fortified like Sevastopol, but destroying it would still require time, men, and material that von Koltitz did not have. Over the following days, German engineers went to work. They surveyed bridges, calculating optimal placement for demolition charges. They examined buildings, identifying structural weak points. They requisitioned explosives from military stocks. 3 tons of dynamite went into Notre Dame Cathedral, placed in the vaulted spaces beneath the roof, wired to detonators controlled from a command post outside the structure. 2 tons went into the dome of Les Invalides, Napoleon's tomb, and one of Paris's most recognizable landmarks. 1 ton was placed in the Chamber of Deputies, the seat of French government. The Arc de Triomphe was targeted for demolition, though the engineers warned it would be only partial destruction given available resources. The Eiffel Tower was discussed, but von Koltitz dismissed it as impractical. Destroy what was feasible, he told his staff. Every major bridge across the Seine received attention. The Pont de la Concorde, the Pont Neuf, the Pont Alexandre III with its ornate sculptures. Engineers surveyed each structure, calculating where to place charges for maximum effect. Von Koltitz walked through Paris in those mid-August days, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes. Colonel Hans J., his second in Imaise, command, usually accompanied him. They walked the Grands boulevards. They stood on bridges crossing the Seine. They visited neighborhoods that had existed for centuries. He thought about Sevastopol, about rubble fields and burned buildings, about months of bombardment reducing a fortress city to ruins. He thought about Hitler's order. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Something was shifting in his mind. This was a professional soldier's growing understanding that the order he had received made no military sense. Destroying Paris would not stop the Allied advance. The garrison lacked strength to hold Paris for more than days once the Allies committed. Blowing up Notre Dame would not delay the enemy by a single hour. It was waste for the sake of waste. Von Choltitz had spent 3 decades following orders, but he was a Prussian officer, trained to think strategically, to understand relationships between means and ends. What military objective would destroying Paris serve? He could not identify one, but disobeying was not simple. He had sworn an oath. In August 1944, officers who disobeyed orders were being arrested and shot. Defiance meant death. The safe course was obvious. Follow orders, pack the explosives, wait for Hitler's command, then blow everything. That was what a loyal German officer would do. Intelligence reports warned that something was coming. The French resistance was growing more active. Communications intercepts suggested coordination among resistance cells. And beyond Paris, the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. Allied forces had broken out from Normandy. The First German Army, supposedly defending approaches to Paris, was described as no fighting force worth mentioning. Paris would be surrounded within days. Von Choltitz understood what the reports meant. The question was not whether Paris would fall. The question was when. The French resistance struck on August 19th, 1944. Von Choltitz had known it, was coming. Intelligence reports had been warning about increased resistance activity for weeks. Weapons caches had been discovered. Communications had been intercepted. The signs were obvious to anyone paying attention. When the uprising began, it began everywhere at once. Barricades appeared in the streets overnight. Resistance fighters seized police stations and government buildings. German patrols came under fire. Von Choltitz's headquarters received reports of attacks across every arrondissement. The resistance was calling for a general insurrection, urging every citizen of Paris to take up arms against the German occupation. Von Choltitz had dealt with partisan warfare in Russia. He knew how to respond to insurgencies. The standard procedure was clear: overwhelming force, immediate reprisals, mass arrests, public executions. Terror was the Wehrmacht's answer to resistance movements. He ordered his troops to respond. German soldiers moved through the streets, clearing barricades, arresting suspects, shooting those who resisted. Von Choltitz maintained martial law and enforced curfews. The Gestapo swept through neighborhoods, rounding up anyone suspected of resistance activity. People died. Not in massive numbers. Not yet. But enough to remind Parisians that the Wehrmacht was still dangerous, even in its retreat. But von Choltitz's garrison was not the force it appeared to be on paper. He commanded approximately 20,000 troops. The number sounded impressive until one examined what those troops actually were. Most of his soldiers were administrative personnel: clerks, supply officers, communication specialists, transportation staff. These were not front-line combat troops. They had not been hardened by years of fighting. Many had never fired a rifle at a human being. Von Koltitz had no heavy armor available. His tank forces had been pulled back to reinforce positions elsewhere. He had no air support. The Luftwaffe was fighting for survival over Germany itself. Fuel was critically short. Ammunition supplies were dwindling. His best troops had already been withdrawn to defend the German border. What he had was a garrison designed to occupy a conquered city, not to fight a battle against a determined uprising backed by approaching Allied armies. And the Allies were approaching. Reports came in daily. The French 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, was moving toward Paris from the northwest. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division was advancing from the south. Allied reconnaissance elements were already probing German positions around the city's outskirts. The bridge at Melun, southeast of Paris, had fallen to American forces on August 20th. The 1st German Army, supposedly positioned to defend the approaches to Paris, was described in reports as no fighting force worth mentioning. Units were disintegrating. Officers were abandoning their commands. Soldiers were disappearing into the countryside. Von Choltitz understood what these reports meant. Paris could not be held. The question was not whether the Allies would take the city, but when and at what cost. On August 23rd, the order arrived from Field Marshal Model's headquarters. Hitler's directive, transmitted through official channels, typed on Wehrmacht stationery with all proper signatures and stamps. The text was unambiguous. The defense of Paris is of decisive military and political significance. Its loss would tear open the whole coastal front north of the Seine and deprive Germany of bases for very long-range warfare against England. Historically, the loss of Paris always meant the loss of France. The Führer repeats his order that Paris has to be defended. The strongest measures to quell insurrection inside the city must be taken. The bridges across the Seine are to be prepared for demolition. Paris must not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Von Koltitz read the order twice. He walked to the window of his office. The Tuileries gardens spread out before him, green and peaceful in the August sunlight. Beyond them, the Place de la Concorde. Beyond that, the Champs-Élysées stretching toward the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler wanted it all destroyed. Von Koltitz picked up the telephone and called Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Field Marshal Model's chief of staff. Speidel was a thoughtful officer, more intellectual than most Wehrmacht generals. He and von Koltitz had served together before. They spoke the same professional language. "I am carrying out the Führer's orders," von Koltitz said. His voice was calm, almost casual. "I am working diligently to detonate the Arc de Triomphe. This will improve visibility on the Champs-Élysées considerably." There was a pause on the line. Then Speidel's voice came through, carefully controlled. "Oh, General, we are thankful you are in Paris." Both men understood what had just been communicated. Von Koltitz was illustrating the absurdity of Hitler's orders by describing them in literal terms. Speidel was acknowledging that understanding. It was not quite a conspiracy, not quite a plan. It was simply two professional soldiers recognizing that the orders they had received were insane. Model's headquarters had received Hitler's directive. They had transmitted it to von Koltitz as required, but they did not press him for immediate execution. They did not demand progress reports. They simply let the order sit there, acknowledged but not actively enforced. Von Koltitz returned to his balcony. Colonel Hans Jai joined him. They stood together, looking out over the city. "It cannot be done," von Choltitz said finally. Not to Jay, not really, just speaking the truth aloud. Even if I wanted to execute these orders, I lack the means. We have no heavy bombers, no incendiary weapons in sufficient quantity, no time to demolish every monument and museum. The bridges, yes, those can be destroyed. But turn the entire city into ruins? It's impossible. Jay said nothing. There was nothing to say. Von Choltitz was discovering something about himself in those August days. He had followed orders his entire life. He had destroyed cities when ordered to destroy them. He had led troops in brutal campaigns without questioning the fundamental morality of what he was doing. He had been a good German officer, reliable and competent, willing to do whatever the mission required. But Hitler's order to destroy Paris revealed something von Choltitz had not fully acknowledged before. There were limits to his obedience, not moral limits necessarily. Von Choltitz was not having a sudden crisis of conscience about Nazi atrocities. He knew what the regime had done in the East. He had seen the mass graves and the burned villages. He had heard the stories about the camps. No, this was something else. This was a professional soldier's understanding that the order he had received was militarily pointless and strategically counterproductive. Destroying Paris would not stop the Allied advance. It would not save Germany. It would achieve nothing except the obliteration of irreplaceable cultural treasures and the death of civilians who posed no military threat. It was waste for the sake of waste, destruction as an end in itself. Von Choltitz had spent 3 decades following orders, but he was also a Prussian officer, trained to think strategically, to understand the relationship between means and ends. Hitler's order violated every principle of military logic that von Choltitz had learned in his years of service. Sevastopol had been destroyed because destroying it served a military purpose. The city was a fortress, a center of Soviet resistance. Its elimination opened the Crimea to German occupation. There was a reason for the destruction. What was the reason for destroying Paris in August 1944? The city was already lost. The Allies were hours away. German forces were in full retreat across France. Blowing up Notre Dame and the Arc de Mimiminte, Triomphe would not slow the enemy advance by a single day. It was, as von Choltitz would later say, a medieval command, an order from a mind that had lost touch with military reality. But disobeying that order was not simple. Von Choltitz was a general in the Wehrmacht. He had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler personally. In August 1944, officers who disobeyed orders were being arrested and shot. The failed July 20th assassination plot had made loyalty the only virtue that mattered to Hitler. Defiance meant death, probably for von Choltitz and possibly for his family. Von Choltitz was not a hero. He had never pretended to be. He was a career officer who had climbed the ranks through competence and obedience. Martyrdom held no appeal for him, but standing on that balcony overlooking the Tuileries, with Hitler's order on his desk and explosives packed into Notre Dame, von Choltitz reached a conclusion that would define the rest of his life. He would not destroy Paris. Not because it was the right thing to do, necessarily. Not because of some sudden moral awakening, but because the order was insane, the situation was hopeless, and following Hitler's directive would achieve nothing except pointless destruction. For the first time in his career, Dietrich von Choltitz decided to disobey. August 24th, 1944. Dawn. The French 2nd Armored Division entered the outskirts of Paris from the north. American units from the 4th Infantry Division pushed into the southern suburbs. The sound of gunfire echoed across the city as German troops engaged Allied advance elements. Von Choltitz stood in his headquarters, receiving reports every few minutes. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. His troops were falling back from the outer defensive positions. Resistance fighters were attacking from within the city. Barricades blocked major streets. The Allies were advancing faster than his intelligence officers had predicted. The telephone on his desk rang constantly, field commanders calling for instructions, supply officers reporting ammunition shortages, engineers asking whether they should proceed with demolitions. Everyone wanted orders. Everyone wanted to know what General von Choltitz intended to do. He gave orders: pull back to defensive positions, conserve ammunition, maintain order, do not engage in actions that cannot be sustained. Standard military responses to an impossible situation. But he did not give the order to detonate the explosives. 3 tons of dynamite sat beneath Notre Dame Cathedral. The detonators were in place. The wiring was connected. All von Choltitz needed to do was give the word, and the cathedral would be reduced to rubble. He did not give the word. 2 tons of explosives packed the dome of Les Invalides. 1 ton in the Chamber of Deputies. Every bridge across the Seine wired and ready. The Arc de Triomphe targeted for destruction. Everything prepared exactly as Hitler had ordered. Von Choltitz walked through his headquarters, past his staff, officers, past the maps showing Allied advances, marked with red arrows converging on Paris. He returned to his balcony. Colonel J was there already, smoking a cigarette, watching the city. The bridges, J said quietly. They will ask about the bridges. Von Choltitz nodded. The bridges were the most defensible part of Hitler's order. Destroying bridges to slow enemy advance was standard military practice. The Wehrmacht had blown bridges across Europe. No one would question an order to demolish the Seine crossings, but von Choltitz understood what destroying those bridges would mean. Paris depended on those bridges for basic functioning: food, water, electricity, transportation. All of it moved across the Seine. Blow the bridges, and the city would be paralyzed. Civilians would starve. Hospitals would lose power. The water supply would fail, and the Allied advance would be delayed by perhaps 6 hours. 6 hours in exchange for crippling Paris's infrastructure. 6 hours bought at the cost of untold civilian suffering. The mathematics were clear. The bridges were not worth defending. Destroying them would achieve nothing of military value. Von Choltitz made his decision. The bridges would remain standing. Throughout August 24th, Allied forces pressed into the city. Street fighting intensified. German troops fought rearguard actions, falling back block by block. Resistance fighters seized control of entire neighborhoods. The sounds of battle, rifle fire, grenade explosions, the occasional burst from a machine gun became constant background noise across Paris. Von Choltitz maintained contact with his field commanders. He ordered them to resist where resistance was practical and to withdraw when it was not. He did not order fanatical last stands. He did not demand that his men die defending positions that could not be held. He was managing a retreat, not fighting a battle to the death. Hitler's order sat on his desk, ignored but not forgotten. Field Marshal Model's headquarters sent no follow-up messages. They had transmitted the Führer's directive. Von Koltitz had acknowledged receipt. Beyond that, model staff seemed content to let events unfold without interference. Perhaps they understood what von Koltitz was doing. Perhaps they approved. Perhaps they simply recognized that Paris was lost and saw no point in destroying it for Hitler's satisfaction. Or perhaps they were simply distant enough from the situation that they could claim ignorance later if Hitler asked uncomfortable questions. The telephone rang again. Von Koltitz picked it up. A field commander reporting that his unit was surrounded, requesting permission to surrender. Von Koltitz granted permission. No point in ordering men to die when the battle was already lost. Another call. An engineer asking about bridge demolitions. When should he activate the charges on the Pont de la Concorde? Not yet, von Koltitz said. Wait for my direct order. The engineer acknowledged and hung up. Von Koltitz knew that order would never come. By the afternoon of August 24th, Allied tanks were moving through the streets of Paris. German resistance collapsed in sector after sector. Von Koltitz's headquarters was surrounded. The sound of fighting grew closer. Colonel J appeared in the doorway. "General, we should prepare to evacuate." Von Koltitz shook his head. "No, we stay here." "Sir, the Allies will be here within hours. If we stay here," von Koltitz repeated. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "If we leave now, someone else might give the order I have refused to give. Better that I remain in command until the end." Jay understood. As long as von Koltitz commanded the garrison, the demolitions would not be activated. But if he fled and command passed to someone else, someone more fanatical, someone more afraid of disobeying Hitler, the explosives might still be detonated. Von Koltitz would remain at his post until French or American soldiers arrived to arrest him. It was the only way to ensure Paris survived. The irony was not lost on him. Dietrich von Koltitz, the smasher of cities, the man who had destroyed Rotterdam and Sevastopol, was saving Paris by simply doing nothing, by refusing to follow orders, by sitting in his headquarters while the city he was supposed to defend fell to the enemy. Night fell on August 24th. The fighting continued in darkness, illuminated by muzzle flashes and burning vehicles. Von Koltitz sat at his desk, listening to the sounds of battle growing closer. He thought about his career, about the cities he had destroyed, about the orders he had followed without question. He thought about Hitler's voice on the telephone, demanding that Paris burn. And he thought about this city, this impossible, beautiful, irreplaceable city that Hitler wanted reduced to ruins for no reason except spite and madness. Von Koltitz had destroyed cities before, but he would not destroy this one. August 25th dawned clear and bright. The sounds of fighting were very close now. Von Koltitz could hear tanks in the streets outside the Hotel Meurice, French voices calling to each other, resistance fighters shouting in triumph. His staff was preparing to surrender. Documents were being burned. Weapons were being gathered. The end was minutes away. The telephone rang one final time. Von Koltitz picked it up. The connection was scratchy, the line barely functional, but the voice on the other ender was unmistakable. Adolf Hitler. The Führer was in his underground bunker in Berlin, hundreds of miles from Paris, separated from the reality of the military situation by layers of staff officers and increasingly desperate reports from collapsing fronts. but he had somehow gotten through to von Choltitz's headquarters in the final minutes before the surrender. Hitler's voice was shaking with rage. "Is Paris burning?" Von Choltitz held the telephone, listening to the Führer's fury crackling through the static. 3 tons of dynamite in Notre Dame, 2 tons in Les Invalides, 1 ton in the Chamber of Deputies, all the bridges wired, everything ready. All he had needed to do was give the order. "Is Paris burning?" Hitler screamed again. Von Choltitz thought about Sevastopol, about Rotterdam, about all the cities he had helped destroy in his years of service to the Reich, about the reputation he had earned, the nickname they called him, the Smasher of Cities. He thought about the balcony overlooking the Tuileries, about the view of Paris stretching away in every direction, about the impossibility of destroying something so beautiful for no military purpose whatsoever. "Is Paris burning?" Hitler demanded a 3rd time. Von Choltitz did not answer the question directly. He made some non-committal reply, acknowledged Hitler's words, and waited for the call to end. Minutes later, French soldiers burst into his headquarters. Von Choltitz stood, raised his hands, and allowed himself to be arrested. Paris had not burned. The formal surrender was signed in the afternoon of August 25th, 1944. General von Choltitz, now a prisoner, added his signature to the document that transferred Paris to the authority of Charles de Gaulle's provisional government. French officers escorted him from the Hotel Meurice. The streets were filled with celebrating Parisians. Von Choltitz was driven through the city he had not destroyed. People lined the sidewalks, cheering the Allied troops, tearing down German signs, dancing in the streets. No one paid particular attention to the German general in the back of an enemy vehicle. The next day, August 26th, Charles de Gaulle led a triumphant liberation march down the Champs-Élysées. Thousands of Parisians filled the broad avenue, celebrating the end of 4 years of occupation. Scattered gunfire erupted from rooftops. Snipers whose identity was never conclusively determined, possibly German holdouts, possibly collaborators seeking revenge, possibly just chaos in the aftermath of liberation. De Gaulle walked through it all, tall and imperturbable, claiming Paris for free France. Von Choltitz, meanwhile, began his journey into captivity. He was first held at Trent Park in London, a country house that served as a prisoner of war camp for senior German officers. British intelligence had wired the facility with hidden microphones, recording everything the prisoners said. Those recordings would later reveal much about what German officers knew regarding Nazi atrocities, including the mass murder of Jews. Von Choltitz spent months at Trent Park before being transferred across the Atlantic to Camp Clinton, Mississippi. He remained in American custody through the end of the war and for 2 years after. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Hitler was dead, shot in his Berlin bunker as Soviet troops closed in. The Reich that von Choltitz had served his entire adult life had ceased to exist. He was released from captivity in 1947, returning to a Germany that no longer resembled the nation he had left. The country was divided between American, British, French, and Soviet occupation zones. Cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. The German military was disbanded. Everything von Choltitz had known was gone. In the years that followed, von Choltitz began constructing the narrative that would define his post-war legacy. In 1951, he published a memoir detailing his experiences in Paris. The book presented von Choltitz as a man who had defied Hitler's orders to save the city, a German officer who had recognized the madness of the Führer's commands and chosen humanity over obedience. The memoir was widely read. It portrayed von Choltitz as a hero, the savior of Paris, the one man who had stood between Hitler's rage and the destruction of an irreplaceable city. The story was compelling. It was also, according to many historians, largely fabricated. The French resistance, which had actually fought to liberate Paris while von Choltitz's troops were still arresting and executing suspected partisans, rejected the savior narrative immediately. Resistance leaders pointed out that von Choltitz had maintained Nazi repression until the final hours of the occupation. Executions continued up until August 25th. Arrests went on until French troops literally burst into German headquarters. Historian Fabrice Vigili conducted extensive research into von Choltitz's actions in August 1944. His conclusion was blunt. Von Choltitz's story was entirely made up. The general had created a legend for himself, casting himself as the man who saved Paris, when the evidence suggested something quite different. The reality, historians argue, was more complicated and less flattering. Von Choltitz had indeed received orders to destroy Paris. The explosives had indeed been placed, but von Choltitz lacked the resources to carry out those orders, even if he had wanted to. His garrison was undermanned and undersupplied. He had no heavy bombers, no incendiary weapons in sufficient quantity, no time to demolish every monument and museum before Allied forces arrived. At most, he could have destroyed the bridges, and even that would have achieved nothing except delaying the Allied advance by a few hours while crippling the city's infrastructure. Von Choltitz chose not to issue destruction orders, yes, but was that a heroic defiance of Hitler, or simply a practical recognition that the orders were impossible to execute? Was he saving Paris, or was he simply managing the final days of an already lost battle in the most logical way available? The truth probably lies somewhere between the extremes. Von Choltitz was not the hero his memoir claimed he was, but he was also not a fanatic who would have gleefully destroyed Paris if given the means. He was a professional soldier confronted with orders that made no military sense, in a situation that offered no good options, making choices that preserved his own life while avoiding pointless destruction. The recordings from Trent Park revealed that von Choltitz was well aware of Nazi atrocities. He knew about the mass executions of Jews. He knew about the camps. He knew what the regime he served was doing in the occupied territories. These were not secrets to a general of his rank. He was never charged with war crimes. Perhaps he should have been. His record in Russia, particularly at Sevastopol, included actions that killed thousands of civilians. But in the chaos of post-war justice, many German officers escaped prosecution. Von Choltitz was one of them. He lived quietly in Germany for 2 decades after his release. He gave interviews occasionally, always reinforcing the narrative that he had saved Paris. His son Timo defended his father's reputation, arguing that the general had indeed defied Hitler at great personal risk. In 2014, a German-French film called Diplomacy portrayed a fictionalized version of von Choltitz's final night in Paris, showing him in Timo's conversation with Swedish consul Raoul Nordling, who supposedly convinced the general not to destroy the city. The film presented von Choltitz as a man torn between duty and conscience, ultimately choosing to save Paris. Historians largely dismiss the film as historically inaccurate. The meeting between von Koltitz and Nordling probably occurred, but the dramatic conversation about saving the city was almost certainly invention. The reality was simpler and less romantic. Von Koltitz received impossible orders in an impossible situation. He chose not to follow those orders. Paris survived. Whether that survival was due to von Koltitz's decision, his incapacity to execute Hitler's commands, or simply the rapid collapse of German resistance around the city, remains debated. What is certain is that Paris survived intact. The bridges stood. Notre Dame's cathedral rose untouched above the Seine. The Louvre's treasures remained safe. The Arc de Triomphe still marked the western end of the Beaux Champs-Élysées. The city that Hitler wanted, reduced to ruins, remained one of the most beautiful in the world. Von Koltitz died on November 5, 1966, in a hospital in Baden-Baden. He was 71 years old. His death received modest attention in German newspapers. Some obituaries called him the savior of Paris. Others were more skeptical. The French resistance members, who had actually fought to liberate the city, had their own opinion. They knew who had freed Paris: French fighters and Allied soldiers, not a German general who had maintained occupation until forced to surrender. But von Koltitz's story persisted. The idea of a German officer defying Hitler to save a great city was too compelling to die, too perfect a narrative to abandon just because historians found it questionable. Perhaps that is von Koltitz's real legacy. Not what he actually did in August 1944, but the story he told about what he did. A story of redemption and defiance, of a soldier choosing humanity over fanaticism, of one man standing between civilization and destruction. It was a good story. It was the story Dietrich von Koltitz wanted told about himself. The truth, as always, was more complicated, but Paris survived. 3 tons of dynamite remained unexploded beneath Notre Dame. The bridges stood. The monuments endured. Whether von Koltitz deserves credit for that survival, or whether he simply failed to destroy what he lacked the power to destroy, historians still debate. What cannot be debated is this. In August 1944, when Hitler demanded that Paris burn, the city did not burn. The order was given. The explosives were in place. The means of destruction were ready, and the destruction did not come. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps in the end, it does not matter why von Koltitz refused to destroy Paris. What matters is that he refused. That in the final days of a collapsing regime, when madness ruled in Berlin and the Wehrmacht was disintegrating across Europe, one general looked at a great city and chose not to reduce it to ruins. Dietrich von Koltitz spent his entire career following orders. He destroyed cities when ordered to destroy them. He led troops in brutal campaigns. He earned his reputation as the smasher of cities honestly, through actions that killed thousands. But in Paris, in August 1944, he stopped. For whatever reason, military logic, personal conviction, simple incapacity, he stopped, and Paris survived. That may be the only completely true thing we can say about Dietrich von Koltitz and the last days of the German occupation. He had the power to destroy, and he chose not to use it. In a war that destroyed so much, that burned so many cities, and killed so many millions, that single choice may be worth remembering. Not because it made him a hero, but because it saved something irreplaceable. Paris stands today because in August 1944, when Hitler screamed, "Is Paris burning?" into a telephone, The man on the other end of that call did not confirm the destruction. The bridges remained standing. Notre Dame's spires still rose above the Seine. The Louvre's masterpieces survived. The city endured. Whether von Coltitz saved Paris or simply failed to destroy it, the result was the same. The city survived. 4 years of occupation ended. The war moved on, and Paris, beautiful and irreplaceable, remained standing. That is the story. Not the legend von Coltitz told about himself, not the hero narrative his memoir constructed, not the myth that films and books perpetuated, just the facts. Orders were given, destruction was prepared, and in the end, the destruction did not come. Dietrich von Coltitz died in 1966, taking with him the complete truth about those final days in August 1944. What he actually thought, what he actually intended, what he would have done if circumstances had been different. These questions have no definitive answers, but Paris survived, and sometimes that has to be enough.